Sweden looks simple, quiet, equal, orderly. But that didn't happen by itself. Walk through Stockholm on an ordinary morning. No one is rushing. No one is shouting. The streets are clean. The queues are calm. The distances between people precise, almost rehearsed. There is a word Swedes use for this. Lagom. It means not too much, not too little, just enough. It sounds like a preference. Some historians suggest it is something older than that, a principle, quietly embedded into law, education, architecture, and daily life over centuries, not imposed from above, absorbed from within. Sweden is consistently ranked among the world's most equal, most trusted, most stable societies. The question worth asking is not whether that is true. It clearly is. The question is, how did it get that way? And whether what looks like culture is also, quietly, a system. What the textbooks say, Sweden's modern identity begins, officially, in the early 20th century. In 1932, the Social Democratic Party came to power. They would remain there, almost without interruption, for the next 44 years. During that time, Sweden built what became known as the folkhemmet, the people's home, a welfare state, universal health care, free education, strong labor protections. The official story is one of democratic consensus, a country that chose equality openly, repeatedly, at the ballot box. And that story is largely accurate. Sweden did not arrive at its social model through revolution or force. It arrived through negotiation, compromise, and an extraordinary degree of social trust. By the 1970s, Sweden had one of the highest standards of living in the world, one of the lowest levels of poverty, one of the highest rates of civic participation. The textbooks call it the Swedish model, a deliberate, democratic construction built over decades by people who believed that society could be designed and then proved it. But behind every model, there are foundations. 5 of them, quiet, old, still holding today. Rule 1, Lagom. The word lagom appears in Swedish records as far back as the 17th century. Its origin, some linguists suggest, may come from the phrase laget om, meaning around the team, as in pass the drinking horn around the group and take only your share. Not more, not less. Lagom. It is often translated as moderation, but moderation implies restraint, a holding back of something you want. Lagom is different. It implies that the right amount is, in itself, the desirable amount, not a compromise, a value. One interpretation holds that lagom was not simply a cultural habit that emerged naturally. It was reinforced over generations through social pressure, through education, through the implicit understanding that excess was not admired. In a country with long winters, limited resources, and communities that depended on cooperation to survive, taking too much was not just impolite, it was dangerous. Some researchers suggest that lagom became embedded in Swedish social behavior precisely because the conditions of Scandinavian life demanded it. The record shows a society with unusually consistent norms around modesty, fairness, and restraint. What it doesn't show is where those norms end and deliberate social design begins. Lagom looks like a word. It may also be a blueprint. Rule 2. The folk high schools. In 1868, Sweden began building a network of schools unlike anything that existed elsewhere in the world. They were called folkhögskolor, folk high schools. They had no entrance exams. No grades, no fixed curriculum. They were open to any adult who wanted to attend, and they were funded largely by the state. The idea came originally from Denmark, from a philosopher named Grundtvig, who believed that education should awaken citizens, not merely train workers. Sweden adopted it, then expanded it. By the early 20th century, Sweden had dozens of these schools across the country, teaching not subjects, but thinking, not facts, but participation. One interpretation holds that the folk high school movement was the quiet engine behind Sweden's democratic culture. It created over generations a population that knew how to discuss, debate, and decide together, not just in parliament, in village halls, in trade unions, in community meetings. Some historians suggest that Sweden's extraordinary levels of civic trust, among the highest measured anywhere in the world, did not emerge spontaneously. They were, in part, educated into existence. The record shows a country with one of the oldest and most extensive systems of adult civic education in the world. What it doesn't show is what a society looks like when that education is absent. Perhaps other countries are simply the answer to that question. Rule 3. The neutrality. Sweden has not fought a war since 1814. Over 200 years of military non-involvement, through the Napoleonic Wars, through 2 world wars, through the Cold War. Sweden watched, traded, negotiated, but did not fight. The official explanation is pragmatic neutrality, a small country choosing survival over allegiance. And there is truth in that. But neutrality is rarely simple. During the Second World War, Sweden allowed German troops to transit across its territory. It continued trading iron ore essential for German steel production well into the war. Some historians have argued, carefully, that Swedish neutrality was less a moral position than a managed one, a way of remaining connected to all sides, of preserving economic relationships, regardless of which power prevailed. One interpretation holds that Swedish neutrality was, at its core, a form of strategic positioning, not pacifism, not cowardice, a calculated decision to remain useful to everyone, and therefore threatened by no one. The record shows 2 centuries of peace in a continent that experienced almost continuous conflict. What it doesn't show is whether that peace was the result of principle or of very careful, very quiet calculation. Either way, it held. And a country that does not go to war has resources, continuity, and stability that warring nations simply do not. Perhaps that too is part of the Swedish model. Rule 4. The architecture of trust. Sweden consistently ranks among the top countries in the world for social trust. Ask a Swede if they trust strangers, most say yes. Ask if they trust institutions, most say yes. Ask if they trust government, most say yes. This is statistically unusual. In most countries, trust in institutions has been declining for decades. In Sweden, it remains by global standards remarkably high. Some researchers have spent years trying to understand why. One interpretation holds that Swedish trust was not simply cultural, it was structural. When institutions are transparent, when courts are fair, when bureaucracies are efficient, when politicians are held accountable, trust follows. Not because people are naturally trusting, but because the system gives them evidence that trust is warranted. Sweden built those institutions slowly. Over the 19th and 20th centuries, it reformed its legal system, its civil service, its press freedom, its electoral process, one layer at a time. The record shows one of the lowest rates of corruption measured anywhere in the world. What it doesn't show is how many generations it takes to build that, and what happens to societies that never tried. Trust is not a feeling. In Sweden, some historians suggest it was an engineering project, one that took 150 years to complete. Rule 5. The Jante Law. There is an unwritten rule in Scandinavian culture. It has a name, Janteloven, the Jante Law. It was described by a Danish-Norwegian author named Axel Sandemosi in a 1933 novel, but he claimed he was not inventing it. He was documenting something that already existed. The law has many formulations, but they share one idea. You are not to think you are anything special. You are not to think you know more than others. You are not to think you are better. In the English-speaking world, this sounds like oppression, like conformity forced upon individuals, and it can be experienced that way. But one interpretation holds that Janteloven served a different function in the context of Scandinavian social history. In a society built on cooperation, on lagom, on folk education, on institutional trust, the suppression of ego was not merely cultural. It was functional. A village where one person claims superiority is a village divided. A society where no one claims superiority is a society that can move together. Some researchers suggest that Janteloven was the cultural operating system behind Sweden's social cohesion. Not a law, not a rule, a shared agreement, passed between generations without ever being written down. The record shows a society with unusually low rates of social conflict, unusually high rates of cooperation, and an almost stubborn resistance to the cult of personality. What it doesn't show is what was lost, what individual voices went unheard, what ideas were quietly discouraged. Every system has a cost. Sweden's was paid quietly, over centuries, by those who were simply too much. Conclusion: Sweden is often held up as a model, a proof that equality is possible, that institutions can be trusted, that people can cooperate, and it is all of those things. But a model is not an accident. It is a design. Lagom-shaped behavior. Folk schools built citizens. Neutrality preserved resources. Institutions created trust. Janteloven held the whole thing together. 5 quiet rules. None of them written in a single document. None of them decided in a single moment. All of them working together across centuries to produce something that looks, from the outside, effortless. That is perhaps the most Swedish thing about the Swedish model. It hides its own architecture. It looks like culture. It feels like character. But underneath, it is a system. The quietest societies are often the most deliberately built. Next, the hidden structures behind Norway's rise. This video explores history and disputed theories for educational purposes.